It was one of those afternoons where the sky felt too heavy, like it had absorbed all the sorrow in the world and decided to weep with the people below. The drizzle had started mid-morning, coating the city of Chicago in a silvery sheen that made the streets glisten and the buildings look softer, less intimidating. But to Amara, nothing could soften the looming presence of the gallery doors she stood in front of. They towered over her, pristine and polished, like gates guarding a kingdom she didn't belong in. Amara Jones clutched her portfolio tightly under her arm, her fingers already cramping from the pressure. It wasn't fear that made her hands tremble, it was hope, that dangerous, wild thing that made her believe she could change her life in a single moment. She had worked months for this chance, staying up through countless nights mixing colors on worn canvases in her small studio apartment. Her fingers bore permanent smudges of paint, her clothes often stained, her back always sore. But she'd never minded the grind. She loved the work. It was the one place in her world where she felt completely free. She had walked into the New Voices in Contemporary Art competition believing this was it. The email had said her submission was shortlisted. They loved the emotion in her work, her use of color, her perspective. They were eager to meet her. So she had borrowed the nicest clothes she could find, pressed jeans, a simple white blouse, and the same black sneakers she wore every day, cleaned until they looked new. Her hair was twisted neatly, her lips glossed, her nerves on edge. The moment she stepped inside the gallery, though, something shifted. It wasn't that the room itself was unwelcoming. The floors were marble. The air smelled like lavender and old books. The lighting was soft, curated to highlight the beauty of every piece on display. But the people, oh, the people. They looked up at her with a pause too long to be polite. Two women whispered behind the desk. One of the men in a navy blue blazer gave her a quick once-over before looking down at his clipboard, pretending not to notice her. "Hi, I'm Amara Jones. I have a 2 p.m. presentation with the selection board," she said, her voice strong despite the weight growing in her chest. The receptionist offered her a clipped smile. "Yes, just a moment." She disappeared into the back office. Amara waited in silence, feeling the eyes on her. When the woman returned, she led Amara down a hallway without making conversation. The door at the end opened into a long room with glass walls and a long wooden table. There were 3 people seated, all dressed in expensive-looking clothes that whispered wealth and pedigree. A white woman with silver hair. A middle-aged man with a perfectly trimmed beard. And a young man in a tweed suit who didn't even bother to hide his disinterest. Amara introduced herself again. They nodded, stiffly. No handshakes. She laid out her paintings on the table, pieces that told stories from her life. A portrait of her mother crying silently at the kitchen table. A surreal painting of kids playing in alleys that were half shadow, half fire. A colorful explosion representing the joy she felt when she received her first art supply kit. It was bold work, raw, honest. She had painted from memory, from wounds, from love. As she spoke about each piece, she watched their faces. The bearded man leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. The silver-haired woman kept adjusting her glasses, glancing at her wristwatch. The young man in tweed scrolled through his phone. "I believe art should reflect not just beauty but truth," she said earnestly, pointing to the canvas of a boy standing alone on a broken basketball court. "It should confront us, make us feel, and, sometimes, it should force us to see people we don't normally look at." The silver-haired woman finally raised a hand. "Miss Jones, we appreciate your submission," she said, her tone careful. "But we're looking for a certain aesthetic this year. Something aligned with the European urban minimalism trend." Amara blinked. "But your call for submissions said you wanted bold, personal perspectives. Voices that are underrepresented." "Of course," the man said quickly, in that too smooth way people talk when they want to sound polite while closing a door. "We had a lot of submissions. Very strong talent this year. I'm afraid your work, while passionate, doesn't quite fit the direction we're taking." She stood there, not saying anything for a moment, waiting to see if one of them would look her in the eye. None of them did. "Thank you for your time," she said, gathering her work quietly. She didn't cry. Not there. Not in front of them. She walked out of the room, then out of the gallery. The rain had picked up a little, falling harder now, splashing against the sidewalk. The world looked blurrier through the water dripping down her lashes. She didn't have an umbrella, so she just let the rain fall. Her portfolio was in a plastic cover, at least her paintings would survive. She stopped near the curb, not to hail a cab or catch a bus but just to breathe. To collect herself. She was angry, not just at them, but at herself for expecting better. She should have known. She'd felt it the second she walked in, how out of place she looked. Not because of how she dressed or spoke, but because she wasn't what they had expected. It wasn't new. She had faced it before. She remembered being in high school, being told by her art teacher to tone down the colors, in her work to appeal to mainstream tastes. She remembered classmates rolling their eyes when she talked about using paint to express grief, about identity. It was always the same pattern: smile, nod, then push her quietly out the door. She didn't know someone was watching her from across the street. A man stood there under a black umbrella, dressed in a long charcoal coat, his face partially shadowed by the brim of his hat. Elias Grant. He had been on his way into the gallery, his gallery, when he'd seen her enter earlier. Something about the fire in her eyes intrigued him. He could tell she was nervous, yes, but she had this kind of raw energy that wasn't common in those halls. Elias had built the Grant Foundation from scratch. A tech entrepreneur turned art investor, he had used his billions to fund projects that promoted diversity in the arts, technology, and education. He had grown up in foster care, bouncing from one home to another, always told he was too intense, too loud, too ambitious. But he had learned to work through rejection. To wear armor. To walk into rooms where no one looked like him and still own the space. So when he saw her leave just 20 minutes later, face blank, movements stiff, something about it bothered him deeply. And then he heard her. She didn't say it to anyone, not even directly. Just under her breath, almost like she was admitting a secret she didn't want to speak out loud. They rejected me because of my skin. It hit him in the gut. She didn't know who he was. Didn't know he owned that building, that he sat on the board of the gallery. Didn't know he was the one who had funded the New Voices initiative in the first place. But even he knew the truth. His money could open doors, but it couldn't erase centuries of conditioning. It couldn't stop the biases baked into the people he sometimes trusted to run his institutions. He stood there, the rain splashing around his expensive shoes, suddenly feeling ashamed. He should have been in that room. He should have made sure the board didn't just look for diverse art to check a box, but actually listened. He watched her walk away, her shoulders hunched, her step slower than when she arrived. Her portfolio clutched tightly to her chest like armor. He couldn't let her story end like that. But he also knew he couldn't just run after her like some savior in a movie. That's not what this was. No, if he was going to do something, he had to do it right. Quietly, powerfully, he turned and walked in the opposite direction. Back to his office. Back to his boardroom. Back to the foundation he had built with the belief that people like Amara, people with raw talent, with voices that shook the ground, deserved to be heard. That night, Elias pulled her file. Read every word. Studied every painting she submitted. Then he looked up her social media, her small website, her blog posts from years ago. He watched a video of her painting late at night, humming to herself while creating a portrait of a young black girl with fire in her eyes. She didn't need saving. She needed a stage. And Elias Grant was going to build it for her. Even if he had to tear down the gallery walls to do it. The bell over the cafe door jingled softly as Amara walked in, brushing the rain from her shoulders. Her shoes squeaked against the worn tile floor, the smell of brewed coffee and cinnamon rolls offering a strange comfort she didn't quite feel. She'd been working at Rose's Corner Cafe for nearly 2 years, juggling early mornings and late night shifts between painting and chasing gallery dreams that never seemed to love her back. She tied her apron behind her back and slid behind the counter, her portfolio stashed in the break room, out of sight but still pressing against her heart. Every time she thought about that moment in the gallery, the blank stares, the rejection wrapped in politeness, it burned all over again. She'd barely slept the night before, her mind spinning with questions she couldn't answer. Was it really about her art? Or was it something else? Something deeper? She didn't want to believe the world still worked that way. But her gut told her it did. As she poured a cappuccino for a regular, her coworker Maya leaned in. "You okay? You look like you got caught in the rain and heartbreak." Amara gave a tired smile. "Something like that. Wasn't today that gallery thing?" "Yeah," she muttered. Didn't go the way I hoped. Maya winced sympathetically. Screw 'em, you're too good for those stuffy art snobs anyway. Amara appreciated the words, but they didn't settle anything inside her. Because deep down, she had wanted their validation. Just once. Just enough to open one door. Hours passed. The cafe bustled with the lunchtime crowd, then dipped into a quiet lull by mid-afternoon. Amara was wiping down tables when the door opened and a tall man stepped inside. He wore a gray cashmere coat, water still glistening on the hem, and carried an umbrella neatly folded under one arm. His presence was quiet, but it filled the space like a whisper you couldn't ignore. Amara didn't recognize him immediately. He took a seat near the window, nodding politely as he settled in. There was something about his posture, the way he held his coffee cup when she brought it over, that suggested wealth, but not the loud kind. This was a man used to expensive rooms and whispered influence. Let me know if you need anything else, she said, offering a neutral smile. He looked up at her. Actually, I was hoping to speak to you. Miss Amara Jones, correct? She blinked. Her smile faded slightly. Do I know you? No, he said gently, but I know your work. She tilted her head, instantly cautious. Are you with the gallery? In a way, he replied. I'm Elias Grant. The name didn't hit her at first, not really. But then her eyes widened. She'd read that name before, on the foundation that sponsored the gallery's showcase. On the plaque at the entrance. The Elias Grant, she said, almost breathless. You're the one who funds the New Voices project. He nodded. She took a step back, arms folding. So, what? You came to tell me my art wasn't up to par in person. No, Elias said softly. I came to apologize. The words knocked her off balance. I wasn't in that room yesterday, he continued. But I should have been. I reviewed your submission last night. You were one of the strongest applicants we had. And yet, you weren't even given a fair chance. Amara stared at him. Why are you telling me this now? Because when I heard what you said outside the gallery, it made me realize I've trusted the wrong people with something important. I built that gallery to uplift unheard voices. To give space to people who deserve to be seen. And yesterday, we failed you. She didn't know what to say. She'd spent so long telling herself that none of this mattered, that the rejection didn't hurt, but here he was, confirming what she feared. That it wasn't her art that got turned away. I'm not here for sympathy, she said at last, voice firmer now. I didn't paint those pieces to be pitied. I know, Elias replied. That's what makes your work powerful. She studied him for a moment. This man didn't seem fake. He wasn't trying to charm her or patronize her. There was something raw in his eyes, like he understood what it felt like to be dismissed. So what now? She asked. You fire your curators and give me a pat on the back. He almost smiled. No, I want to offer you something else. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and slid a small envelope onto the table. Inside was a formal letter, an invitation to a solo exhibition at the Grant Foundation's private art space. Fully funded, full creative control, a launch attended by collectors, critics, and press. Amara stared at the letter, unable to breathe for a second. This is real. Yes, we'll handle all the logistics. All you need to do is paint. She looked up at him, tears suddenly brimming in her eyes. Why me? Why now? Elias leaned forward. Because what you said outside the gallery shook something in me. I've built my life around tearing down walls, but somehow, I let one get built inside my own house. You didn't just speak a truth, I felt it. And I realized that if I don't act when I see injustice, then I'm no better than the people who built the system to begin with. Amara exhaled slowly. You don't owe me anything. No, he said, but I owe my mission everything. And part of that is making sure your voice gets the space it deserves. She ran her fingers along the edge of the envelope. Her mind was still trying to catch up with what was happening. One day, she was being turned away. The next, she was being offered everything she'd dreamed of, by the man who held the keys to the kingdom. I need to think, she said honestly. Of course, he nodded. Take your time, my number's inside. He stood to leave, buttoning his coat. As he reached the door, she called after him. Wait, he turned. Why do you care so much? She asked. People like you, rich, successful, you don't usually show up in places like this. Elias paused, then walked back a few steps. When I was 16, he said, I got rejected from a scholarship interview because they didn't believe I wrote my own essay. The woman interviewing me looked at my file, then at my face, and said, this must be a mistake. I remember leaving that building thinking my future was already set. That I was going to be one of those kids who just got forgotten. Amara watched him silently. But someone else saw me. Gave me a second chance. That changed everything. So now, I try to be that person when I can. He didn't wait for a response. Just nodded once more and stepped into the rain. Amara stood frozen in the middle of the cafe, envelope still clutched in her hand. Later that night, she lay on her bed staring at her ceiling, the letter on her chest. Her thoughts raced in every direction. Was she ready? Could she really step into a world that had always pushed her out? But then she thought of her mother. Of the neighbors who came to see her murals. Of the kids who passed by her studio window and stopped to stare at the colors she poured into life. She remembered how it felt to paint, not for approval, but to breathe. Maybe this wasn't about acceptance anymore. Maybe it was about taking up space, loudly, proudly, and daring anyone to look away. She picked up her phone and texted the number in the envelope. I'm in. The response came moments later. Welcome to your future, Amara. And just like that, the door that had always been locked opened wide.